With the release of the early access of Voidhome, I thought it would be a good idea to do some companion videos, with the best one to start with being the new conflict system and how it differs from the regular Cypher system and other tabletop RPGs. New players to RPGs seem to be picking this up, but I find that existing players, which have been playing with normal initiative systems for quite a while, are having a hard time changing their mindset, or as Dean from the Cypher Unlimited would say, shift your paradigm. So let's get into how it's different, and I'll bring you through some example scenes as well. In a traditional RPG, like Dungeons & Dragons, Pathfinder, and so on, everything rolls for an initiative value, which then slots them into a specific order. You can see on the left here, I have some in a particular order. On the left here, we show an example. We have PCs A, B, C, and D, and bandits 1 through 5. They all rolled whatever check they needed with the appropriate modifiers or extra dice, and once they had their final values, they ended up in this left order right here. The Cypher system, which is the core engine that Voidhome uses, is close to that, but with modifications that makes it a little bit more looser. In Cypher, the NPCs all go in the order of their level automatically, since the GM doesn't roll any dice. Characters then make an initiative task roll with the option to apply effort, rerolls, and so on, which let them know where they slot themselves in between those NPCs. Players of the same area between NPCs can choose to go in whichever order they think makes sense, with the combat then playing out in that rough order turn by turn, until it reaches whatever completion trigger it needs to stop. As an example on the right here, once again we have PCs A, B, C, and D, and bandits 1 through 5. Although in this case 2 of the bandits are level 3, and the remaining 3 bandits are level 5. After all the rolls are done and modified however everyone needs, we get this order. Player managed to succeed against difficulty 5 by rolling that or higher, so player A gets to go first. Then we have the level 5s going. The GM can choose which order they go in. It doesn't really matter, they're on the same level of the stack. Players B and C have succeeded against difficulty 3 or higher, but not against difficulty 5, so they've likely got difficulty 3 or 4, so they go between those in that stack. The players themselves can choose which ones go first and can sort of negotiate which makes sense. Then we have the level 3 NPCs, and finally player D down here probably rolled really shitty on their initiative and didn't succeed against anybody, so they are the ones that go last. Just like regular traditional initiatives, once they're slotted into this order, it's very rare that you're going to change out of this order until the combat comes to an end, whether things need to die or another trigger happens. Before we get into the initiative thing, we need to talk about some other changes. The first big change with Voidhome is that it has no combat state. There is no rolling initiative because combat has begun. What it instead has is conflict. But even then, there's no firm line about when a conflict begins or ends, because there's no moment when the GM goes, okay, stop, roll initiative. That and the conflict does not mean combat, although combat could be a part of it. This is why Voidhome does not have any damage numbers or health scores for NPCs. Firstly, situations can have their own stats, just like NPCs. So that exploding space station, tough financial corporate negotiation, or even cooking challenge on a live broadcast can all have their own stats, special actions, and modifiers. This is why we have new things like impact and presence, because it rarely makes sense to do damage to a situation like the collapsing asteroid base by shooting it with a pistol. But it does make sense if you have impact to the presence of a collapsing asteroid base station with your training in movement as you try to run through it. Which brings me to the next part. Impact is not damage. Yes, weapons and abilities can do impact with attacks, but even then, that doesn't always mean you're damaging things. The shot might have damaged them, but it could have also maybe broken the person's gear, or scared them, or affected them in some other way. But training in various skills and knowledges in Voidhome can also do impact. There is nothing to say that one person can't be using their training in social to demoralize the presence of the bandits with mental impact, while your buddy is shooting his shotgun at the same time, doing physical impact. You both impact the presence of the bandits, just in different ways. This helps to move Voidhome away from a traditional combat simulator during action scenes to something a little more mixed. Theoretically, you could solve an entire hostile encounter with those vicious bandits entirely through training with social impact, knowledges, and smart planning without ever actually making a single attack. I did this because it fits more in line with many of the sci-fi that we take as inspiration for games like Voidhome. In the movie Alien, there are a few times that the crew physically fights the xenomorph, but there are many more times that they use their training, cunning, and planning to try and overcome everything that's going on. In the movie Event Horizon, there's very little in the way of actual physical combat, but there's a lot of psychological conflict and situations that need to be overcome with the character's training and other actions. You tend to see this in the more grounded sci-fi much more than something like fantasy, which tends to be big dumb heroes fighting the bad guys. Next, we get into the default initiative system for Voidhome, or rather the lack thereof. Part of the reason there's no hard break between combat and not combat, like you see in other RPGs, or even in a regular Cypher system, is that there's no initiative turn order. Instead, we do have the refresh, which is when everyone would get their number of actions back, and any triggering circumstances may happen. The rest of the time, the GM has control over which NPCs or situations would act and in which order. They are not bound by having them to go in order of their level, although you could still do this if you wanted to. And their order does not have to be predetermined. The GM can use their actions as the events unfold. Thus, this can change every refresh, because all that really matters is that the NPC or situation has a certain number of actions. It doesn't matter when they're used. This way, it's a little less predictable. The most difficult foe doesn't always go first, so the players need to pay a little more attention to clues about what's going on and react accordingly. So, when do the players go? Well, that's kind of up to them. Players have two options. They can take action, which means after the refresh or after the GM is finished with an NPC or situation's actions, any number of players can say, hey, I'd like to use my action now. If multiple players want to go at the same time, then it's just like normal Cypher, where players that would go at the same time decide amongst themselves which would go first. All the players can even decide they'd like to take action immediately after the refresh, before anything else is gone. Although, that might be to their detriment, because they have no idea what the GM has planned as events unfold. Yeah, it's cool if all the APCs on the spaceship go first, but then there's no one left to interrupt the suicidal bandit that pulls out a grenade on a spaceship. Well, speaking of, a player also has the option to interrupt an action. This is after an NPC or situation already has an action underway, but no rolls have been made or resolved yet. As a player, you can say, hold up, before the action resolves, I want to interrupt it with an action of my own. This action doesn't have to be related to what's happening, but it could be if you wanted it to. In fact, your interrupting action may very well cancel out the NPC or situation's action, causing it to do nothing instead. However, interrupting doesn't just automatically work. This is when you roll your training and initiative. If you succeed, then you get to interrupt them. But if you fail, you do not interrupt this action, and it resolves normally unless someone else interrupts. And there may be penalties for retry if you attempt to do another interrupt before the next refresh happens. This is why you may not always want to take action immediately. If all of the PCs took action, and then that bandit pulled out the grenade on your tiny pressurized spaceship, and there's no one left to interrupt him from doing something very bad, well, let's just say life's going to be unpleasant. Okay, let's tie it all together with an example conflict so I can show you how this works in Voidhome. The characters, Jane, Macy, Tarko, and Vlad, are attempting to flee a collapsing asteroid base, which is a level 4 situation that has little gravity and no oxygen. What they don't know is that there are a group of 3 security robots roaming the hallways, 2 at level 3 and a big one at level 5. So we're just going to quickly hide these because they don't know about them. The players begin to run down the hall, trying to flee to their ship. This scene is being played out entirely theater of the mind because it's kind of hard to have a map for a constantly changing and collapsing environment like a space station in the middle of falling apart. So theater of the mind just helps to make this more cinematic and creative. The The players have been describing to you how they're fleeing for their lives, when suddenly you, as the GM, decide the collapsing base is going to do something and sort of start us into a conflict. This is seamlessly moved from an RP experience to a conflict, possibly without the players even realizing it at first, because the situation is initiating the conflict, and the players can't really take action right away. But if they wanted to, they could immediately interrupt, although in this case, no one does. With situations, you can either direct it to do something as you normally would, or you can roll from their list of suggested actions. There's usually a list of 3 to 6 suggested actions on most stats within Voidhome. In case, as a GM, you can't decide what you want to do, or you want to make things a little more unpredictable, or maybe you're doing this as a solo play or GM-less co-op play. In this case, the GM decides to direct the actions, saying that the collapsing base station causes part of the bulkhead to buckle in such a way that a shard of metal jabs out towards Macy. No one says they want to interrupt this, so Macy rolls her speed defense and thankfully succeeds. The GM does let the players know that the situation does have 2 actions per round, with 1 more remaining, and that will be used later. After the situation goes, the GM states that the party can also see 2 of the robots in the distance, although they have not yet acted. Tarko and Vlad both state they would like to take action after the situation. Just like in regular Cypher, if they've decided to go at the same time, they need to discuss amongst themselves who will go first. They decide Vlad will go first. Vlad takes a shot with his rifle with an attack at the smaller robot, succeeding in dealing 8 physical damage to the robot. Then Tarko goes. He states he's worried about the structural stability of the area they're in, so he's going to take the manipulate action against the situation by using his training in low-tech and his hand welder to reinforce part of the plating. Remember, situations have presence just like an NPC does. He rolls against the level of the situation, and he succeeds. Since he is trained in low-tech, he deals 4 impact to the situation, and the GM decides it makes sense for the impact in this case to be thermal since he's using his welding torch. No one else said they wanted to take action yet, so the GM decides that they're going to use an action from one of the NPCs or situations, and they decide on the little robot that was just shot at, and that will go next, retaliating against Vlad by moving forward and stabbing at him with the jagged metal of its old rusted body. Vlad attempts to defend himself but fails and receives 3 physical impact. His suit has 1 physical resistance, so he only takes 2 impact instead. To make things fun, the GM proposes an intrusion to Vlad that has to do with the attack that just happened, which he accepts, gaining 1 experience and giving the other one to Jane, knowing that she's the one that'll likely patch him up if things go bad. With the GMI accepted, the GM states that the attack pierced Vlad's suit, causing it to gain an oxygen leak. Until it's patched, Vlad is going to roll a depletion on his oxygen resource every refresh. Now, none of the players want to take action yet, so the GM decides the big robot's going to go next, and much to everyone's horror, it levels a grenade launcher. As much as Jane wants to fix Vlad's suit, she realizes a grenade in an already crumbling station could spell disaster. So she declares she attempts to interrupt the big robot's turn with one of her own. She rolls her task with her training and initiative. After some rerolls and modifications, she finally succeeds, interrupting the robot. So the robot gets pushed down, and Jane slots herself in, interrupting it. As the robot raises its grenade launcher, she moves up and attempts to use her ability that would temporarily shut down a high-tech device. She rolls against the big robot's level and succeeds. The big robot is shut down before it has a chance to use its grenade launcher, losing not only its current action, but probably being taken out of the conflict at this point. And because she's moved up, she also noticed the hidden 3rd robot. Macy is the last player to have actions left, and she decides she's going to take action next after what should have been the big robot's turn. She's going to level her taser at the small robot that's already been attacked. She succeeds and does enough shock impact that the robot collapses to the ground, defeated. The collapsing asteroid base still has 1 action left this round, which the GM would like to use. Since none of the PCs have any actions left to interrupt or take actions anyways, the GM's free to do whatever the GM wants. The GM decides to roll randomly from the situation's stat block for its action and rolls for a spray of oil to expel from a broken pipe at Macy. Macy rolls a speed defense to duck under the spray but fails, and it temporarily applies the blind condition with a special removal circumstance that lets her get rid of the condition if she spends an action to clear it from her helmet. And finally, the last robot. It approaches Jane, becoming visible to everyone, and reaches out with its clamp. Jane unfortunately fails her defense task, and the robot clamps onto her arm and twists violently as she screams in pain. This particular action on its sheet says it deals no impact, but instead applies the dislocated condition to an area, in this case her left shoulder, something that may take some time and help to remedy. In the meantime, her left arm is completely useless as she screams out in pain. Everyone now has used all of their actions, and we move to the refresh, bringing everyone that's still part of this back. Firstly, before everyone gets their actions back on the refresh, we need to do any triggering events. In this case, Vlad has his oxygen leak, so we need to roll for depletion for his oxygen rating. He has an oxygen resource of 5. Rolls a 1d6, and the result is a 3, which is equal to or below his rating, which means his oxygen resource depletes from 5 to 4. Uh-oh, he's starting to lose his oxygen. Alright, all the triggers are now out of the way, so everyone gets their actions back. Players can now ask to take action right after the refresh if they really wanted to, or wait to see what some of the opposition does and plan their actions or interruptions accordingly. Theoretically, the players could all take action immediately after the refresh, but they don't know what devious plans the GM has that they may want to interrupt or react to later. So that's a risk. The rest of the conflict plays out, with the GM deciding that the condition to end it is to lower the collapsing asteroid base's presence enough that the PCs escape before it finally crumbles on top of them, all while being harassed by the security robots. And that's it. That's how it plays out in Voidhome. As you can see, it ebbs and flows more to unfold a story rather than the more board gamey, you wait for your turn, make an action, move on to the next turn in the order, rinse and repeat. This way, players not only feel engaged the entire time, waiting to see if they act or react as the situation unfolds, but it's an ever-changing narrative environment. It was important to me when designing this, however, to make sure that there was still a structure to follow. If we're in a situation where it's anybody for themselves and they can kind of act when they want, that starts to get a little bit too loose for a nice and balanced game. Personally, I like this new method. I mean, I wrote it for a reason. You kind of just dip in and out of needing a refresh or not. There's no break in the flow of the moment for everyone stop the roleplay, roll initiative. I do implore you to at least try the new conflict system in Voidhome. I've had a number of people now that originally balked at the idea because it's so much more freeform than the traditional initiative systems that were introduced by games like D&D and then accepted and evolved into what games like Cypher has. But then once they tried Voidhome's conflict system, they pretty much all said the same thing. They like how seamlessly it's blended in with roleplay and that it felt like it was a natural extension of it, rather than a separate mode that you shift into. It only took a few refreshes for them to really understand and accept it. So there we are. That's kind of a brief rundown of how the conflict system works in Voidhome and differs from the normal Cypher rules. I hope this video was useful to everyone, but I know it was especially needed for those that are, say, well experienced in previous systems, because they need to have that paradigm shift to adapt to working differently. If you haven't gotten Voidhome, you can pick up the early access at my Ko-fi shop. Link is in the description below. So as always, stay healthy, stay safe, and have a good one, eh?